Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and this is a dialogue on how do we create a more empathic world and society. And today I'm here with Amy Wilson to talk about empathy. Hi, Amy. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Edwin. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, let me give you a little bit of an introduction. This is what I have from your website, too. So it's Amy Wilson is a change leader, community builder, movement maker, and empathy advocate. Yay for empathy advocates. Amy specializes in building, sustaining cultures of innovation and social good mission, and is the author of Empathy for Change. Yeah, you got one too. We can do two of them. Hold it
Everybody
to the side so
one.
we can have both. Everybody should have one to the side. Live it to the side. Yeah, there we go.
To the side. Here we go.
No, I meant like to my side so I can see your face.
To your side.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. It'll be a good screenshot for the
yes.
for the clip.
Good.
So do you want to add anything by way of introduction about yourself before we kind of dig in deeper?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer questions about how I got to this place around empathy. I think, that's a good summary of the work that I did. But, one of the things that I have seen over, I guess I would say my entire career is this kind of belief that, we're lacking the sense of empathy. I worked, just to give you a quick overview of, I say in 5-year increments where I've worked. In 2005, when Hurricane Katrina hit, I left my consulting job and joined AmeriCorps, NCCC, National Civilian Community Corps, to go gut houses and build houses because I felt, for me, a sense of empathy because of the people that were down in the Gulf Coast. And then I designed a project to rebuild 50 homes in 4 months during that time. And then in about 5 years later, I'm back in the DC area. I'm back in the consulting realm. And in that space, I'm working at Booz Allen Hamilton this time in a consulting realm and DC. And, I'm leading this culture, building a culture of innovation, which I thought it was really fascinating when you say building a culture of empathy. I was literally building this culture of innovation at this 100-year-old firm, trying to rethink and reshape what that might look like. What does this 100-year-old firm that created consulting in many ways 100 years ago, and what does it mean for today's context? So that was back in 2010. So this has been more than a decade. I've been trying to rethink and reframe what does big institutions, what is the role they play in today's society? And in 2015, that's when I joined the White House. It's the end of the Obama administration at this time. I joined as an entrepreneur in residence for the White House and do a number of initiatives. Then go on in between the Obama White House, stay into the Trump White House. As an entrepreneur in residence, I get to see both sides of the spectrum, and I'm the leader of innovation.gov. So I create a shared language around innovation, around change in government that is different than what is the private sector, right? So I'm doing the public sector kind of work, and fascinating work. We did about 600 pages of research. And then I realized that at the end of the day, we needed community. We need people to feel comfortable. And in center of all of that is empathy. So as I progressed, here I am 2015 and then 2020 with a pandemic and everything like that. I could see, over the 20 years or so of my career, I have seen so many arrows pointing to this place around the lack of empathy that we're seeing. And that's what I wanted to write about in my book and explore my own sense of empathy, which, StrengthsFinder says is my biggest strength. And I'm also a highly sensitive person and an empath as well. So let's bring that into the conversation too.
Well, how did you come across the word empathy or even the concept of empathy? Do you remember how, is this through your whole life you kind of had that word, or was it you started seeing it? I know Obama had talked a lot about the empathy deficit, and that was, one of the motivations for me sort of getting interested was hearing him as well as I was doing some work on progressive values, and George Lakoff said, hey, progressive values are based on empathy. And then I started looking into it, and that was sort of the first, where I kind of got the word, and I was doing some interviews and people were talking about empathy, and I just felt a lot of emotion there. So I'm wondering, how did you even come across the term and the concept and so forth? Do you remember?
Yeah, this is a fabulous question. Because I've been thinking about it as well, as like, why did I settle in this word as opposed to all the other words that I could have used, right? Compassion, is a word that comes up very frequently in my conversations with people. And I think, to tell you the truth, empathy has always been a part of who I am. The word empathy came in a little bit later. I guess I would say I could feel empathy before the word came into my context. And so one of the things, my mother was a nurse for 45 years, and she was just this she's still alive. She's very loquacious and personable, and I could tell that the stories that she would tell about the patients that she would be seeing and the caring that she would give to my sisters and I, was that sense of empathy that I could really tell that she was giving. But the word empathy, when I mentioned before about being in the Strength Finders test, it's like this test that you take, answer 200 questions and they tell you what your top strengths are. And it's about focusing on your strengths rather than your weaknesses. And my top strength out of the top 5 out of 32 different strengths was empathy. And that was when I think I can point to this place where that's where the word showed up in my world. And my reaction, I was taking this at a consulting firm, right? At that consulting firm, Booz Allen, on this innovation team. And I was like, why did I get empathy? That's not helpful at all, right? And the top 4 of my 5 strengths were all about relationship building. And so I just remember kind of having disgust towards this name, because I was like, how is this going to be helpful in my job? Right. But later on, I think, the more and more I thought about it, because it kept coming back, this conversation around empathy kept coming back. And what I think, when I had a particularly difficult, learning experience after the Trump administration, I was in the sabbatical that I was taking to kind of reset myself, this word came up again. And it was through a conversation with one of my mentors, when he said, listen, what do you want to write about? You're going to write a book. He's like, what do you want to write about? And I was like, there's something interesting. There's 2 parts about myself I haven't really explored. And one side is empathy, a highly sensitive person, that empath side of me. And I was like, maybe that there's a key there. Maybe there's something that is changing, that is making me successful, because I have led innovation and been in places that kind of lead this change. And so I looked at an intersection, like change and empathy. And so that's the kind of the crux of how I started researching the paper and talking to people who are leading change in the world with empathy at the center of it.
Well, your work, when you say innovation, what comes to mind is human-centered design.
Yep.
Is that something you work with?
Yeah. That is something I work with. There's other phrases that we talk about. Human-centered design, we talk about agile, agile design development. We talk about, the trifecta is agile, human-centered design, and lean startup. So taking these concepts that come from Silicon Valley and bringing it into the work that we do every day. So building things fast and in short iterations. So you build something, you show it to an audience, get feedback very quickly. So you don't build this thing that people don't need. So it's all centered in the human experience.
Well, the human-centered design, it's very centered here in the Bay Area with the D School at Stanford and IDEO, which is also, they've been working on it for a long time. and their design model starts with empathy. So within the innovation design community, empathy is a big concept, in the sense that any innovation that you do, or anything that you want to design for people, you need to take into consideration the impact, the emotions, the feelings that people are going to be experiencing. So I was wondering, was that sort of something? So like that was like an influence too, like, oh, design, empathy.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, that was we have this thing called an empathy map that we use in the design process, where we come in and we step in and we start saying, what is this person thinking, feeling? What are their pain points? What are the gains they're hoping to get in life? Like have a family, have a house, all these different things that they want to have. And so what's interesting in that experience is that I took a class at the Stanford D School, got a certificate in design thinking, I think in 2013 or so. And then I ended up getting a certificate in innovation and entrepreneurship at Stanford. And so it is this concept of empathy right at the beginning is part of that. But as I talk about later in my book, I actually mention how that design has to evolve with where we are in the world today. And I can talk more about that, but that's something that I was thinking about, like that empathy that we have is kind of perpetuating some systems of oppression that I've kind of found out through my research and through talking with these people, is that we have to kind of be very aware of the biases that we have as humans are also showing up in our design.
Well, yeah, let's explore that a little bit. The design, so in a sense, you'd like to redesign design thinking or human-centered design. And so how would you do that, redesign? We'll just introduce the design thinking. So in this human-centered design, the IDEO model is you empathize with what the needs are of people. You hone it down to a problem statement, a pain point. Then you have a brainstorming session, sort of a creativity, coming up with ideas. You hone in on one aspect, and then you create a prototype quickly, as you were saying, and then you go and test that, and then you start the whole process again. So it's an iterative process, quickly designing something, getting getting feedback and testing, and then iterating again. So that's the basic framework as the design school talks about. So how would you address these issues of oppression?
Exactly. So there's many different, there's a pathway that is being designed. There's two schools of thought that is, one of the people who created this one is called Equity-Centered Community Design, or ECCD. One of the people I interviewed in my book, her name is Antoinette Carroll. She's out of St. Louis, Missouri. She is specifically looking at systems of oppression and how do we redesign the world with using people who haven't had power in the context of our country to start thinking about what might the world look like around you. And there's two big pieces of context here that's really important, is that actually I would say three. First of all, empathy has to be coupled with humility. Feeling like you're not better than anybody else, that everybody else around you when you're doing design. And what happens in the design process often is this idea of power and agency. That it was the last part of the three that I talk about. So when you were talking about design, often you mentioned before, we're designing for someone else. So when we talk about systems of oppression, we're actually talking about these two aspects over here that if somebody is designing for someone over here, you are creating that designer and saying that designer is the person who's kind of like a god or something like that in this context. And then the person you're designing for actually is inferior. And so what we're trying to do, and we're having lots of conversations in kind of the design context, is to kind of shift the power so that you're actually now designing with each other, and you have shared power between each other, right? And so it's you're no longer designing for that person, you're designing with. And that's a shift that we're talking about in a lot of ways. And then the other thing that comes along with this is this idea of agency, which is the natural human ability to change the world around us. And so what we're doing in this instance is like giving more agency to the people who who have been previously thought of as inferior, or not in the conversation. You're giving them more agency to now be equals within that conversation. But then when you talk about it in a bigger way, a lot of people who are in the design process are thinking about, how do you actually change the power dynamic to give more power to the people that need it the most, that may have been historically disenfranchised, working in different contexts. And the thing that kind of sums this up in a great way, on top of that, is this idea of called Old Power versus New Power. It's a book that came out in about 2018. And Old Power is this idea that it's leader driven, like there's hierarchy that's involved in our organizations. It's like very militaristic. It's command and control. You do what I tell you to do. So power's at the top. Everything at the bottom is, everybody on the bottom just follows the orders. Where we're going, and the Obama administration is a big reason why this is happening in the government, is this idea of new power. So we're transparent, we're open, we're participatory, we're peer driven. We're in the space where power is no longer just at the top. It's now a current that you give to the different people that need it at a given time. So that is a concept that I think is really impactful and important. And that's where we're kind of going as a society. Especially technology has pushed us in that direction. But it's really interesting, if you look at the people who have old power values are the ones who are leading our country in many different ways and leading our organization. So there's a mismatch of those values.
Yes, that's a great thing to explore, is empathy and power. You know, what is the relationship of empathy and power? And I know several years ago, you know, I was very interested in human-centered design, you know, took courses at Stanford as well, and went through some design projects. You know, IDEO has these courses that you can co-organize them. And I went through several of them, you know, like, and sort of explored that. But then when I was looking into human-centered design, there was a co-design community. So that sounds like what you're talking about. It was coming out of Europe, I believe, when I first started hearing the inklings of it, which is that there's not the designer and the designees. You know, you're trying to bring everyone together to co-design whatever products or services or systems that are there. And I see an analogy too with the therapeutic world, because the therapeutic world has been a client-therapist relationship. And that's where this empathic listening, you know, based on active listening, empathic listening on the work of Carl Rogers, that kind of spread throughout the whole therapeutic world, is there's a therapist, and then the client, and the therapist listens to the client, and then, you know, gets their problem solved by them being heard. But when I saw that too, I had the same sense that, you know, they're only doing half the part. You're as a patient, you're only being heard. You're not learning to empathize. It's not looking at an empathic relationship. Yep. I see that as you know, the same as what you're talking about in design. You're trying to create an empathic relationship between the designers and creating a community sort of design, of co-design, as well as, and that's where I got interested in this empathy circle process, because in the same way, the empathy circle is sort of a power with. You've done the empathy circle facilitator training and know, so you have small groups and everybody listens to each other. And there's even though there's maybe a facilitator who holds the space, they have the same responsibilities as everyone else. And if everybody knows the practice, you don't even need a facilitator. It's just like, well, we know how this works, and there's hardly anything to do. So I think that that's really, yeah, I can see how that's sort of like an edge there for society to have more of this co-design, co-empathy, practice.
Yep. Absolutely. And you mentioned that the empathy circles training that we talked about, it's having a ripple impact that I wanted to mention. So, it was wonderful. And I somehow through the ether found you and the culture Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And it's interesting. I was like, somebody said to me recently, it was like, you didn't find Edwin's work while you were doing research. And it just happened that I didn't find the work. But then it wasn't until after I published the book when I started seeing that you have these empathy circles in this group that's here. And I was just like, I want to sign up for that. That sounds amazing. Like, I want to learn how to do empathy circles, because I think we do need that sense of practice of empathy and active listening, which is lacking in so many different areas in our lives. And the ripple impact is happening is that after I talked about this, I have three sisters. One of my sisters is a professor at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She was the chair of the math department. And she's super empathetic. She actually brought the first when Elaine Aron wrote her book on the highly sensitive person, she bought the book for me and gave it to me. So she definitely understands a lot of things, but she was talking to a lot of the DE&I experts there, and they're doing this thing called a day of dialogue. And in the conversation, she recommended to the planning committee for the day of dialogue to do empathy circles. And then she said, I talked to her recently and they said, yeah, they're actually deciding to, that's one of the top 4 things that they're doing in that day of dialogue, the empathy circle concepts. And so I think it's so needed right now. And if we need to spread it far and wide, because I think everybody has this deep innate feeling to feel seen and heard. And we don't have spaces to do that as much as we do. We should.
Yeah, we've been doing these intro cafes every week, and it kind of went viral on LinkedIn. So it's been like something like 6,000 people have shown interest. Only a very small minority actually show up, but it's been a very diverse, international, racially diverse, culturally diverse people, group that have been coming, and everybody's just like talking about the energy, because the cultural energy is so jagged and so much stress and so much conflict. You come into an empathy circle and everybody's listening to each other. It's like, oh my God, this feels so good. So it's kind of like the more stress the society gets, the more they're starting to appreciate that, listening, how important listening and dialogue is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So necessary. It's so important today. Especially when I feel like we're talking across each other, especially when we talk about the mask mandates, conversations around just getting vaccinated. I feel like, everybody's just, just feeling like shutting out the other person when they don't really fully understand why they're doing what they're doing, right? And so I think that's so important, right? It could be something for us as difficult as that, but just, working with your family members or a partner, like having an empathy circle just with a partner, or if you're polyamorous, you can have them with your multiple partners, and it can just build understanding almost immediately.
Yeah. So in terms of one thing I did want to ask you about too is, the book is Empathy for Change. And, Obama said, hope and change, and change is this big word. I've been unclear what is meant by change, in the sense that there's, you could say that Hitler and Stalin had change, right? It's like, it seems to me there's something missing, is that it's like if it changed towards an empathic culture change. So I'm wondering, maybe I'm just sort of missing something in terms of how the word change is sort of defined. Maybe
Yeah.
I just wonder, so
Yeah.
maybe you just could say a little something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. It depends on, I think the reason why the word change is difficult to kind of pin down is because it depends on the context you use it, right? And who's in charge, who's leading the change, who's participating in the change. Kind of like what I was talking about before, power. If you have somebody who's leading a change with this belief that you can build power within ourselves to be change makers, to build power within historically disenfranchised communities, that's the kind of change I would want to see in the world, but not everybody believes in that, right? And so things that I've done in the federal government, one of the roles I was taking on was this belief of I was taking a new center of excellence around transformation, which was a center of excellence on like IT transformation, right? And one of the aspects, there was these different centers of excellence. There was about 6 or 7 of them. I was the one that came about 8 months into it. They realized that at the end of the day, that they've been focusing on technology and shifting the technology, and they forgot about the people. And I think when we talk about change in technology today or innovation, I don't actually, even though I've been the director of innovation was there for about a decade, I don't like always using the word innovation in this context. And that's why I talk about change, because really at the end of the day, innovation equals positive change, and that equals empathy plus action. So if we empathize with each other, and I actually have the quote where I kind of defined empathy in my own way when I talk about it in the context of change. And let me look at it here. Okay, so to have a better understanding of empathy, my definition is responding to the thoughts and emotions of others with a purpose of meeting each other's needs. So on the front cover of the book, I have a head, a heart, and a hand. That is central to both empathy and to change when we talk about changing the culture in the world. So cognitive is the first kind of empathy. This is from Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. Cognitive empathy is like, am I willing to take your perspective, is the first step. The second step is emotional, the heart. So it's like, am I willing to feel your emotions and feelings? And you have to kind of understand your feelings in relation to somebody else. And the last one is compassionate empathy, which is the hand, which is like, it's all of those things that I was just talking about, taking perspective, feeling with that person, but then you're willing to help if needed. So I think for me, when I think about change, that is kind of like that core belief is like, are we willing to be in community with another person and help bring about what they need in the world, right? And if I also in the book extrapolate that to a bigger way, and when we talk about change management is the world that I've come from in a lot of ways too, which is a flawed system on itself. It talks about the head, the heart, and hand in a bigger culture. So I extrapolate that to, if you were to build an empathic culture, you really have to design with the people who are in that culture to change the culture, to make it with the head, the heart, and the hand in the mindset. So that's kind of how I couch all of that.
Okay, so change, if I'm understanding it, is that you start with empathizing with others, and then through that empathy, you're getting a sense of what the needs are, and then you're co-designing solutions or way of addressing those needs. And that's sort of so the change for you would be starting with that empathy and ending with those, or going through that process.
Yeah, I would say just quickly that is all right. I would say it's this awakening that we're hoping to get with change comes down to intention and attention. So having the intention very early on that when we're designing, we're not just designing, we're not creating that for, I'm not designing for someone. I'm going to be coming in and bringing them in all parts of the process, the people we're designing with, right? So it's this mindset that we're continually, like, we're bringing those people into the conversation, into the design process. And then at the end, you actually measure if you're making the impact or not, right? And paying attention to that over time. And if you aren't, try to figure out what are some approaches that might help with this that your thing that you're designing.
So would it be then that for you that change is co-designing, creating a co-design space? It's that coast, and then going through that co-design to address each other's needs in a sense, and then having some kind of you're saying that having some kind of a measurement if that was successful at the end.
Yeah, so that's when we talk about in innovation space, we talk about like evidence-based design. And so you want to have evidence. So it will be like you interview people. You also might have some survey or qualitative measurement in the government space. You might measure how many, they have this thing called A and B testing. So you test two different options out, and then you test to see which one is more effective. So if you send out 2 letters from, say, the IRS, no, let's not say the IRS. Let's say from, like, if you're asking people to sign up for CHIP benefits, like or unemployment benefits, you might have it phrased in different ways so that you can see which one is actually more effective, the way you phrase these letters, to get more people to sign up for it, right? So there's different ways that you can do that and be like, okay. And I think we talk about a lot of conversation. Another like buzzword that people are using recently is equity. And that's something that, we're trying to get closer to, and we're trying to have a deeper understanding of how might we design with equity at the center of everything. And equity is, a lot of people think about equality and equity together, but what a simple way to describe it, which someone in my book mentioned, Antoinette Carroll, she mentioned equality is the same, giving things the same things to people, or sameness. Equity is giving different things to have different outcomes. So you don't give them the same thing. One picture that I have shown before is a series of 4 people on bikes. And if you give equality, everybody gets the same bike. It's like, there's like a handicapped person, there's a child, there's an adult, and then there's just a regular size, like a female. And then that's equality. You all get the same bike, and not everybody gets to use that bike, right? Because if you're handicapped, you probably can't pop on a bike, and like as a child, you can't get on an adult sized bike. But then equality allows you to kind of have different modes. You know what the mode of transportation is. You're getting from point A to point B, but you have different ways to meet those needs. And I think, that sums it up in a great way, where you're saying the change is about helping to meet each other's needs and having that attention, and making sure, are we meeting the needs in various ways?
Well, that's again, I think the empathy circle is a real model for what you're talking about, because the circle can, people come together and everyone gets to be heard to their satisfaction. And we use it for conflict mediation too. So you got, problems where there's some kind of a conflict, participants come together and they have, one person speaks to someone, they get a reflection when what's been said, the person, reflects their understanding to the satisfaction of the speaker. Did you really hear me? And yes. And so that's sort of a test. And you're talking about measurements. That is a measurement, right? It's like they are measuring, they're checking. Did the person reflected what I was saying? Did they get it? And you checked, is that accurate to what my experience was? So that is sort of a test. And then there might be a conflict. and then people explore the nature of the conflict. You get some understanding of where everyone was within the conflict, why it happened, what the actions were of each person during
How
maybe a
they felt
moment where
about it.
something, when
Yeah.
some problem happened. And then you have a stage where you talk about, well, what do we do now?
Mhm.
Right. And then you have an empathic dialogue, and you sort of are co-designing a solution. So it could be like, the tree, your neighbor's tree is hanging over your backyard, and it's, dropping all this junk on your backyard, and you're pissed
Mhm.
off. And you have an empathy circle, mediation with your neighbor, and you say, well, what are we going to do? Well, we'll cut off, the thing, we'll share the cost, or whatever it is. You come to
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
agreement with each
Yep.
other. And so that is sort of that negotiation, and that each person has their needs, right? Of
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
and maybe one side says, oh, I don't have any money to pay for this. And the other side, well, I have the need for, clean backyard and, space and so forth. And
Exactly.
then they kind of talk about it and come up with some kind of a solution. So I see that as sort of a model for, for the bigger,
Mhm.
design
Mhm.
practice. I don't know if that sort of
Yeah.
resonates.
Yeah, it does. I think one of the things that I'm diving deeper into is nonviolent communication, and which definitely is not taught in like consulting environments, and a lot of environments that I have been in. And I think we're all coming at this from different angles. And I think and of course, when we come to a conversation, you don't know how somebody's feeling in a particular day, or what their needs are, until you start asking to them. So I think the communication is a big aspect here. Is that when I was in my undergrad, I studied communication, was my degree. And studied intercultural communication. And a lot of that is like the communication is two-way communication. And so often we just have so many assumptions about somebody else. We have so many assumptions about how how somebody is feeling or thinking or what have you, right? Or they assume that somebody is knows what you're thinking and needing, right? So we often don't communicate those things. And so I love that the aspect of having empathy circles, especially in times when there's a lot of conflict, because I think it like slows down our reaction, being defensive in a lot of ways, and especially when there's conflict. It slows down like kind of like our nervous system, so that we can respond rather than react in so many different ways. And so many times we're reacting to what somebody's saying instead of truly understanding what they need.
Yeah, especially on these current topics, racism, equality, equity. Uh, there's so much that people get upset so quickly, and then
Mhm.
they just don't really hear each other. And so that's where I think the empathy circle comes in. In fact, a lot of people from the diversity, equity, inclusion community, trainers have started coming to the empathy circles, and then it's like, hey, we can use this in those environments. So
Yeah.
I think it's going to spread there. I had
Mhm.
one thing. I know these are, charged racism, for example, topic is quite charged. Where, I've been I have like issues with a lot of what's going on with the, in the politics, the political left, with this
Mhm.
anti-racism. And
Mm.
I think, and maybe I just get your thoughts on this,
Yeah.
is that you have the power over, which is, the patriarchy, the, a dominance culture, racism, etc.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that the empathic approach is to empathize with racism instead
Mm.
of being anti-racism. That anti-racism is just sort of a perpetuation, and that there's sort of
Mm.
racism, which is unempathic. You're dominating, you're seeing yourself as superior, and it's a
Mhm.
form of
Mhm.
judgment. But then to be against it is also sort of in a conflict. It's not like hearing what's
Mm.
behind, the racism. And so I'm thinking that there's really a third point, which is the empathy approach, which is to listen to both sides, the racist and the anti-racist, and bring them together into an empathy circle. And I don't know if you saw it, I did an interview with Daryl Davis, who's
oh yeah, you told me about that when you interviewed for the Empathy Power Up.
Yeah. So he would go, and actually he's African American, and he went and reached out to the Ku Klux Klan, actually befriended members, and it was through his reaching out, listening to them, that they kind of changed their views. And they gave him their robes, and he has like 200 KKK robes that people have given him their robes. And
that's powerful.
his TED talk has like 11 million views. He's been written about in the New York Times, etc. So I'm wondering what you think about that, because there's with the social justice community, it's like, we have to be against this, against that. And I'm thinking that the empathy movement is really about empathizing with all these different forces, and then trying to get them to dialogue and empathize with each other. So I'm just wondering how that resonates.
Yeah, I think what resonates with me is that I do think that, I love that the pathway of bringing the people together and seeing both sides of the story. Because with everything, there is always two sides to every story, right? And so, or multiple sides to the story if there's multiple people involved. So I think that conversation is really necessary. A thing that I'm also thinking about when it comes to, a lot of things are really charged, like there's a lot of emotions that are coming out, and I think people are leading with those emotions. I think that underlying a lot of racism is fear, and that they're no longer going to, they're going to lose some rights, or there's something that, that's stopping somebody else from seeing them as humans, or on the same level as they are. And what is interesting in the research that they say is that what stops empathy from being had, and us to go down this path of empathizing and being humble and seeing the humanness in people, is that if you don't even value them as a person, you're stopping there, right? You're not even taking their perspective, right? And a lot of things, there's Indy Young does some great work in the design and empathy space around perspective taking somebody else's perspective. And so I think in a deep way, an empathy circle like achieves that, tries to slow things down so that you can help see that person's perspective. I think we can also get to a place where we can feel our feelings, but I think one empathy circle is not going to solve all of our problems, right? Something that I talk about with my with a partner, I have a thing called a organization called the Empathy for Change Collaborative. And I have about 6 people in the collaborative where we talk about some pain points we're seeing in the world, and we're trying to design different things. Kevin Shaw, who he and I co-created this like empathy power up, where you came on the show the other day to bring in this like dose of empathy on Tuesdays, and then we're gonna have one later today. But then another person that I talked to in my collaborative is called Rudy Ngempe, and he is from Austin, Texas, and he does immersive dinner experiences. And he's been doing it for about 5 years or so. He's African. He brings in the conversation. He brings in food, drink, stories about Africa, and that idea of Africa, and like 2 people who may have never experienced this before. And there's a whole bunch of empathy that happens in that experience, and it's about connecting with other people. And so I've been working with him to in a lot of different ways, and I'm going to talk to him later today. But he and I had this moment where he realized, and I think this is a crux of the difference and why racism, where we need to go with the idea of racism. instead of being anti-racist and, racist, having them as two ends of the spectrum. There's a lot of gray area in between there. I think in so many different ways, if we accepted that we were a little bit more we're all have some kind of biases or racism in there, and having that approach where it's like, okay, let's bring them to light and then examine them is important. But then, so Rudy, the person from the African man who is in Austin, Texas, my partner working on things, he and I had this moment where I was like, let's focus on, like, I was taking a DE&I perspective of like, let's focus on like, how are we different, right? And celebrating our differences with each other. We've probably seen the iceberg where it's like all the things you see and then everything underneath that you don't see. And then he said, I think we need to have a different conversation. I think we need to have a conversation about how alike we all are and how similar we are rather than the differences. So what would happen if we had a dinner experience to say, you have this human piece about you and I have this human piece about you. What if we started from that place where we talked about our similarities over our differences? And so that has become a fundamental kind of belief system that he and I are working with when we talk about our immersive dinner experiences that we're building out and doing, is like, how do we bring teams together to not automatically think about the isms of the world, but let's talk about our humanness. So,
instead of the criticism or differences, try to find that commonality with each other and to hear where those commonalities are.
Yep.
Yeah. So we just did it recently in one empathy circle. People can have different topics, and one of the topics someone came up with is what brings you joy in life. And it was so powerful. It's like everybody's like sharing these, subtle little stories about what brings them joy of, seeing the sunset or hiking up the top of a mountain in the evening and seeing the sunset. Someone else is sleeping outside just on their porch, I guess have some woods and just seeing the sunrise. So all these little stories of something that's just a positive experience, and the whole space was sort of filled with these positive stories, which was really good. It's a little bit like what you're talking about. It's like, hey, what's sort of more of these positive aspects of life?
Yeah, you can shift the energy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So yeah.
I was just saying, I love that. So it's so important. And I had a thought about it, but I'll let you continue on, because I'm sure you have other questions.
Yeah, it was the empathy circle. And, you're saying, I think you're saying like, wow, you can't do it in one empathy circle. I agree. That's why I see the empathy circle as something that is a first step gateway practice, that if we can just spread it as widely as possible, my goal is every person in the world learns how to take part in it and to facilitate one. And this is, it can start in grammar school. I mean, first grade, kindergarten could already be learning this practice. I mean, I wish I would have learned it back then. And in families, and if we can get politicians, Trump and Biden, instead of having a debate, if they would have had an empathy circle, we could just spread this practice. I just see it as a first step gateway practice. And you had mentioned NVC, or nonviolent communication, which is also based on the same foundation as empathy circles, which is the work of Carl Rogers with using active listening or empathic listening. But being a bit more focused on the felt experience, naming a feeling, and then, if you're feeling anger, what is the need? What is the feeling that someone wants that they're not getting, that they have to be angry or depressed or whatever. So I think that adds another layer. So did you say you had done NVC training too, or?
I'm diving into a little bit more. I have not gotten trained in it. I actually talked on Timothy, who was one of the trainers. I spoke on television, on radio with him on his show.
Oh yeah.
And he was telling me about nonviolent communication. What I find is interesting, and this might take it in a different path, is that we can talk in a nonviolent way, but I think one of the challenges that we have as a society is the fact that we're not really paying attention to our mental health as much as we should, right? I think one of the challenges, and I experienced this, I think I kind of changed, evolved my thinking around this, and I've assumed that I think a lot of people just have trauma, past traumas that they haven't experienced. It could be trauma, can be many different things for you, but I certainly have had that in my life, and we're not necessarily processing those traumas. So we, in some ways, and I know this from my personal, from myself, because I'm diagnosed with complex PTSD from past experiences. And I realized that my two things that happen with me is that I dissociate my feelings. So when things get stressful or busy, I just shut my feelings off and I just keep going. I think that that's part and parcel of all of society, a lot of society, where we don't tap into our feelings because we just need to keep going. And a second thing that happens with me, is that I shut my feelings off and then I isolate. So, I mean, this is actually becoming a byproduct of the pandemic, especially of people who are prone to alcoholism or isolation in the first place. I shut myself off from people and humans, right? So I think there's an empathy circle and nonviolent communication and all these different ways of engaging with people is getting us out of the isolation that sometimes we had a forced isolation with the pandemic, right? And it's gotten worse. I know from personal experiences, my own experience, that the isolation has made us more lonely, has made our mental health struggle. And you can see that with, I struggle to get into therapy offices now to talk through things. So I think if we did not isolate and tended to live in communities rather than the networks that we often find ourselves in, be in true community where we feel seen and heard, like the empathy circle can give you. But then also we start feeling our feelings. I think those are two essential things that like we need to be doing more as a society. So.
Yeah, well, I think that's the essence of empathy is, the original term is feeling into, Einfühlung, which is, the German feeling into. So the core is that sense of felt experience. And I have that too, kind of growing up, I would sort of disassociate too. I know that feeling is, I would sort of withdraw so that I could see the big picture, right? So if I can see the big picture from a withdrawn space, I can see what's sort of happening. But I do find it's healthier to be, more present. And I think that is what I've been learning through the empathy circle is in how to do that in sort of a safe way, where you don't have to compete to be heard. I mean, another part is, right, you have to sometimes in our society, you have to compete to be heard, and then it's a big competition and like, oh, I don't want to do this and that kind of stuff. So how do we create environments where we can be heard in a non-competitive way?
Yeah. And sometimes the loudest person in the room is the one who gets heard. Not the quiet people who might be just needing to process things a little bit or are having a reaction to something that somebody said. So I think we often just are so busy with the things that we do, and we feel like we have to be perfect with everything. Something that has to do with like the conversation around isms and like the racism in particular is there's this amazing body of work by Tema Okun and the standing up for racial justice around the principles of white supremacy and how they show up in our society, and things like having perfectionism, feeling like you have to be perfect. Like when I was in consulting, I was told it has to be client ready before I show it to anybody, right? And that sense of perfectionism that we feel and we're told constantly is really damaging to ourselves, right? And to our humanness. And another principle of white supremacy is a sense of urgency, right? And I think nonviolent communication, empathy circles slows down the process as this, if having a sense of urgency, it's very easy for us to just keep going with what we've always known and shut out the people who haven't been participating in this world, right? But if you do slow down and you do say, we're going to take our time to understand what the true problem is here, and all aspects of it, and not just a sliver of the problem or a symptom of the problem, we can just be just in a better place later on down the road.
Yeah, and empathy is the gateway to all that. So I'm hearing about power, power over and power with was one aspect where empathy is sort of the gateway to move from power over to power with. I'm hearing that loneliness and empathy is the way out of loneliness. It's creating a connection. And so it's, that empathy, I really see that that's what we need, is this more empathic culture and society that it's just, it's totally unappreciated sort of a process. There is one aspect of what I think about, in terms of the racism, is with the civil rights, right? You could say, hey, to the African Americans could have said in Birmingham, we'd like an empathy circle with the powers that be, right? And then they would say, no, we don't need to talk with you. We like the way things are. So that's sort of the power over. And it took nonviolent direct action to bring the parties to the table. So that's one aspect, I think, in terms of society. If we're going to change society, that it might need some of that direct action. So I'm thinking of taking our empathy tents and setting up in front of the White House and demanding that the politicians take part in empathy circles.
Well, I mean, I live in DC, so you can't really set up in front of the White House right now because it's blocked off.
The park.
But
there,
I know,
Lafayette
I know
Park
the
is blocked
concept.
off.
The park that's right, like the driveway that's right in front of it is been blocked off for a while. I don't know if that's changed in the past week or so. I haven't been down to the White House in a while, but yes, conceivably, yes, you can have these dialogues with people. And I think something that popped up to me when you were talking about power, we talked about power over, power with. But then there's something that I think is really important here that I think we miss as a society as well, is power within, and power within ourselves to feel like we can be part of the change that we wish to see, like Gandhi says, right? Be the change you wish to see in the world. And I often, for example, I didn't go to graduate school. A lot of the stuff I learned along the way. So I come from this place of being like, oh, I'm never good enough, right? And I had to wait for people to tell me, oh, you're an entrepreneur, you can do this, right? Like having other people tell me that I have the power within myself. And what if I started in this place where it's like not in a kind of like a Gordon Gekko way, or just like I can just change the world in a negative way, but like I have had the power within myself this whole time. I have like a magic wand that I can go and make incremental changes that can lead to this bigger change that we're happening. I think all of this is so important to our work, is that we often don't think that we can be that part of that change. So how do we step into our own power and start having those empathy circles, having dialogues, responding over reacting, the power within ourselves to understand our mental health, right? And getting a sense of that so that we can be in better community with other people. I think that's a responsibility we all have as humans, to understand ourselves and to build that power within ourselves to change the world.
And how would you create that? How do you take that sense of agency, sense of power, I guess that's against hopelessness and indifference and apathy would be the thing that kind of keeps you from taking initiative and starting to take that sense of responsibility and action? How is
Yeah.
there some?
I think two things that need to happen is that we need to just understand ourselves, if you have access to therapy, even if you take somebody that you feel close to and you feel safe with, and have conversations with that person
Mm-hmm.
so that you can understand yourself better. If therapy is not available, right? Seek out opportunities where you're just like, what do I care about most? Because there's a million things that we could care about. But what is the thing that I think could push our society forward in a good way, right? So, and then focus on that one thing, and try to give your time and effort when you can to that. The other thing I think about when it comes to changes that we can make and is an important piece of this dialogue. And another person I talked to was this woman named Mari Nakano. She is the director of the Service Design Studio in New York City. It's a form of design. Service design is a form of design that looks at like a service, like a government service, and looks at the different process to see where we can improve it along the way. Mari works with government agencies across New York City to understand how can we make a better service for the people who are receiving our services. And they do incredible work there. And she said, we must move beyond empathy. We must move into a place where we're making actual change happen. So if we're a government agency, if we're a person who's interviewing people, taking time people from away from people, might be talking about traumatic experiences that they've experienced through this service or anything, or surveys, we have a responsibility to actually turn and change the world around us. And I think so many times people just is taking from especially people who are historically disenfranchised or underinvested communities, is to how can we make sure that we get to a place more of like we're designing with each other, like that power dynamic is different, but then also hear what they're saying and actually make that change happen, and move mountains to make it happen, because that's at the end of the day what's most important, the people who are receiving the services, so that's what I think about.
Yeah, so well, what's coming to me around that is that so how does that interchange come, that sense of agency come? I think one aspect of that, so how it connects to empathy, is when we just talk with each other, especially like in an empathy circle where you get heard. It's like an idea, a new feeling, idea, or insight sort of forms, and it's by sharing it with someone else that it seems to grow in its sense of size and potentiality. And when I share it with someone else, that, oh, here's this idea I have, it's a tentative, little nub of an idea, I'm not sure about this, but when I share it, it's like it starts moving into the world. So I think that, so that's sort of in an empathy circle, if you have a sort of a safe container to share these ideas, and then how does this land, work with someone else, what do they think, and then you hear it back too. When you hear those ideas back, it's like, oh, you get that external reflection. And it does seem to be a space for ideas, energies to sort of grow and bloom. And so in those sense, people who maybe have this, have feeling a sense of power, have been over or marginalized, that if there's a space where you can share those ideas with others, it can sort of grow into consciousness. And I guess the part you're talking about is how do you start taking, I guess in terms of the action part, what I would say with the person who's saying is empathy is enough, I think empathy gets, there's this concept out there that empathy is not action. In a sense, right? Oh, we have empathy, that's great, but we need action. It's like, well, what is action? Is it like, writing letters to the Congress? Is it, doing some tangible physical thing? What is action? And I think that empathy itself is highly action it is a huge action, because when you're in an empathic relationship, your oxytocin is flowing, your stress level is going down, your well-being, which is helping it's counteracting cortisol and stress hormone. So that, I guess I just want to say that for all these people, if you're out there and you think that empathy is not action, empathy is highly action. And I think it's one of the most actionable things that there is, and it gets a bad rap that it's not seen as action, because action is a lot of times seen as sort of busy work out there doing, calling your Congress member, or, feeding the homeless or something like that. But that the empathy itself is maybe one of the most actionable things out there. So yeah, I don't know how that kind of resonates.
Yeah, I think in order to have one of the things I like to focus on is systemic change, right? And so changing the systems in which we're in, like the super it, right? So that we can have a more empathic society or a more empathic company or organization, that I like to focus a lot in. And so I agree that empathy does have an action, like the hand, right, which is the action part, like putting a hand out. And at least from the compassionate empathy part of things, it says, I'm willing to help if needed, right? So there is action in there. You're thinking about this. A lot of it has to do with your internal dialogue, and like the cortisol levels are lower, and all of those things that you would talk about when you do have empathy for somebody else. But it's just like trying to find out what is that thing that would make that person's day better or make that person's life better. And I think that's where the going beyond empathy piece is important, right? So when we talk about a systemic change, having just individuals change in that is important, and is of course important for this ripple impact that we're talking about. But to change the system, we need to change more than just be in a space where we care about each other, right? So there has to be some kind of tangible, like in a way of the service design, like Mari Nakano says, is like there has to be a physical change to how I receive my CHIP funds or my Medicaid funds, that feels like the system cares about what they have to say. And then my agency is my power and agency to change the world around me is actually, I'm heard and seen, right? That's what it all comes down to, is like, are we heard and seen in the world? And, is the action being taken? And is our governments, is our organizations really reacting in a way that is empathic, right? So
that's the change that I'm looking at. Is the change of there's systems, right? We have the government, there's a Congress, there's rules of behavior, how everyone's working within the government. So for me, the change would be to have empathy circles embedded into the system. So representatives on both sides have to have a weekly empathy circle with each other to discuss how do we overcome polarization. So there's a system, and you have a time, and you have to sit down and talk with each other. And that's done through all the, throughout the states as well as the change is like, well, we have empathy, start teaching empathy practices in schools, from the get-go. So the change I'm looking at is the replication of systems that foster more empathy within the social structures, like the court system, for example, right? It's like, that there'd be more restorative, I call them restorative empathy circle versus restorative justice, but a restoration, if there's been harm done or conflict, that the social structure, there are social structures in place for this empathic, spaces for this empathic dialogue and skill building, as well as, like prisons. For me, it seems like prisons should be empathy circle training facilitation. It's like you do ongoing, when you come out, you're like a highly skilled empathic facilitator,
That'd be great.
Yeah. So
I think it will take leaders to step into this role, at least for right now. Like until there's a groundswell of people saying we want more empathy, and we're already starting to see this, right? I just wrote an article about how people, especially in America, are leaving their jobs because they're not experiencing empathy in the workplace. I think that there is going to be, over the next decade, a lot of change that's going to be accelerated, partly because of the pandemic and our awareness that is happening around racism and equity and things like that. So things are going to be changing, and I hope that we do go into a place where leaders do shift into more of a new power dynamic, where they say that we're open and participatory and with each other and caring about each other, rather than saying, well, you know what, at the top, I say what goes at the top, and then everybody else should follow. That kind of inferiority, like superior inferior dynamic, is not there. That person will probably not want to do an empathy circle, to tell you the truth, right? So.
Well, how about you and I run for office with
Let's
the
do it.
empathy
Yeah.
banner? I've been thinking of
Yeah.
adding empathy to my middle names. Would be vote for empathy.
I love that. And actually, this just occurred to me. I have a friend who's here in DC who has this organization called Empowered to Run. And he teaches people who are running for office how to, like, whether it's state or local organization people, that human-centered design and different innovation processes that they need to know, so that they're like, how do we work with constituents to really listen, really? And like, that's what he was telling me the other day. He was like, yeah, like the number one thing people kept saying is like, just shut up and listen, at the end of the day. And so that's the thing that that came out of that and was like a successful conversation. But what if our constituents, that people who are in Congress, or in a bigger way, or state and local organizations, really did understand human-centered design and did practice these kind of empathy circles, it would be absolutely transformational, for sure.
Well, where are you going next with your work before we close? Just want to heir what your plans are for the.
So I already have about 3 or 4 clients that I'm working with directly to kind of build a culture of empathy. I'm about to hear another contract that I'm going to do, where I'm redesigning a major healthcare system in the US. Can't talk about it right now because the contract hasn't been awarded, but it would essentially build a sense of empathy, a sense of communication and community around human-centered design, and how do we spread that practice in the federal government in a bigger way, how we can have a greater sense of focusing on the people who matter the most, the recipients of the services that we have. So if all goes well, I will be doing that in about a month's time, working and trying to get in the government, understanding that, and trying to kind of, that for me is like that systems change is what I hope to have in a bigger way. And so right now I'm 6 months into the book launch, right? I've 6 months into it. And so I'm already thinking about what book I want to write in the future. And I think just diving deeper into this empathy thing is just, I actually have a little ring here. I don't know if you can read it, but it says empathy on it.
No, yeah, like my shirt, like
It's a signet ring that I got for myself. Just to be like, just to continually have empathy. I know I already have it internally. So yeah, that's what's happening for me, is like, I have this collaborative work that we do. Is kind of in my research and development arm of the work that we do. So we're dealing with a number of things there. The most recent thing that I've been working on is creating a safe space for people to talk about dysfunctional workplaces and heal with each other. And so it's a little bit different than a empathy circle. It is certainly about learning and feeling seen and heard, but that's something that I'm really would love to have for dysfunctional workplaces, which there's plenty of them where we are. So yeah.
Great.
So next,
It sounds like you just keep innovating, keep working on different projects that
yeah.
and keep spreading
And
the empathic practices and process. So
I have my
great.
hands in many different pies.
Yeah. So, well, great. It was just a delight talking to you, Amy, and I hope we can keep in contact and keep, collaborating and just doing whatever to create a more empathic culture together.
Yes. Thank you for having me, Edwin. Like, it's a pleasure to see you and to talk to you again. And thank you so much for the work you've been doing for years to push this forward. And let me know how I can be of support. Anybody else can reach out to me. I'm on social media at Real Amy J. Wilson. You can reach me anywhere on social media there. You can also reach me at amy@amyjwilson.com. I'm happy to talk more about the book or anything else you want to talk about. So thanks.
And the links will all be down in the description. So it'll be links directly. So thanks.